Chapter 8 of The Best Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Best Man by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 8. The man slept, and the train rushed on. The night waned. The dawn grew purple in the east, and streaked itself with gold. Then later got out a fillet of crimson, and drew over its cloudy forehead. The breath of the lilies filled the little room with delicate fragrance, and mingled strange scenes in the dreams of the man and the woman so strangely united. The sad little bride grew restless and stirred, but the man on the couch did not hear her. He was dreaming of a shooting affray, in which he carried a bride in a gold pencil, and was shot for stealing a sandwich out of Mr. Holman's vest pocket. The morning light grew clearer. The east had put on a vesture of gold above her purple robe, and its reflection shone softly in at the window, for the train was just at that moment rushing northward, though its general course was west. The sleeper behind the thick green curtains stirred again, and became conscious, as in many days past, of her heavy burden of sorrow. Always at first waking, the realization of it sat upon her as though it would crush the life from her body. Lying still with bated breath, she fought back waking consciousness as she had learned to do in the last 3 months, yet knew it to be futile while she was doing it. The sun shot up between the bars of crimson, like a topaz on a lady's gown that crowns the whole beautiful costume. The piercing, jeweled light lay across the white face, touched the lips with warm fingers, and the troubled soul knew all that had passed. She lay quiet, letting the torrent sweep over her with its sickening realization. She was married. It was over, with the painful parting from dear ones. She was off away from them all. The new life she so dreaded had begun. And how was she to face it? The life with one whom she feared and did not respect. How could she ever have done it but for the love of her dear ones? Gradually she came to remember the night before, the parting with her mother and her brother, the little things that brought the tears again to her eyes. Then all was blankness. She must have fainted. She did not often faint, but it must be. Yes, she remembered opening her eyes and seeing men's faces about her, and George, could it have been George, with a kinder look in his eyes than she had ever thought to see there. Then she must have fainted again, or had she? No. Someone had lifted her into this berth, and she had drunk something and had gone to sleep. What had happened? Where was everybody? It was good to have been left alone. She grudgingly gave her unloved husband a fragment of gratitude for not having tried to talk to her. In the carriage on the way he had seemed determined to begin a long argument of some kind. She did not want to argue any more. She had written tomes upon the subject, and had said all she had to say. He was not deceived. He knew she did not love him, and would never have married him but for her mother's sake, and for the sake of her beloved father's memory. What was the use of saying more? Let it rest. The deed was done, and they were married. Now let him have his way and make her suffer as he chose. If he would but let her suffer in silence, and not inflict his bitter tongue upon her, she would try to bear it. And perhaps, oh, perhaps she would not live long, and it would soon be all over. As the daylight grew, the girl felt an inclination to find out whether her husband was near. Cautiously she lifted her head, and, drawing back a corner of the curtain, peered out. He lay quietly on the couch, one hand under his cheek against the pillow, the other across his breast, as if to guard something. He was in the still sleep of the over-wearied. He scarcely seemed to be breathing. Celia dropped the curtain and put her hand to her throat. It startled her to find him so near and so still. Softly, stealthily, she lay down again and closed her eyes. She must not waken him. She would have as long a time to herself as was possible, and tried to think of her dear mother and her precious brother. Oh, if she were just going away from them alone, how well she could bear it! But to be going with one whom she had always almost hated. Her brother's happy words about George suddenly came to her mind. Jefferson had thought him fine. Well, of course, the dear boy knew nothing about it. He had not read all those letters. those awful letters. He did not know the threats, the terrible language that had been used. She shuddered as she thought of it. But in the same breath she was glad that her brother had been deceived. She would not have it otherwise. Her dear ones must never know what she had gone through to save them from disgrace and loss of fortune. Disgrace, of course, being the first and greatest. She had feared that George would let them see through his veneer of manners and leave them troubled. But he had made a better appearance than she had hoped. 10 years had made a greater change in him than she had expected. He really had not been so bad as her conjured image of him. Then a sudden desire to look at him again seized her, to know once for all just how he really did seem. She would not want to notice him awake any more than she could help, nor dare lest he presume upon her sudden interest to act as if he had never offended. But if she should look at him now as he lay asleep, she might study his face and see what she really had to expect. She fought the desire to peer at him again, but finally it gained complete possession of her, and she drew back the curtain once more. He was lying just as quietly as before. His heavy hair, a little disordered on the pillow, gave him a noble, interesting appearance. He did not seem at all a fellow of whom to be afraid. It was incredible that he could have written those letters. She tried to trace in his features a likeness to the youth of 10 years ago, whom she had known when she was but a little girl, who had tied her braids to her chair, and put raw oysters and caterpillars down her back, or stretched invisible cords to trip her feet in dark places, who made her visits to a beloved uncle, whom he also had the right to call uncle, though he was no cousin of hers, a long list of catastrophes resulting in tears, who had never failed to mortify her on all occasions possible, and once but the memories were too horrible as they crowded one upon another. Let them be forgotten. She watched the face before her keenly, critically, yet she could see no trace of any such character as she had imagined the boy George must have developed as a man, of which his letters had given her ample proof. This man's face was finely cut and sensitive. There was nothing coarse or selfish in its lines. The long, dark eyelashes lay above dark circles of weariness, and gave that look of boyishness that always touches the maternal chord in a woman's heart. George used to have a puffy, self-indulgent look under his eyes, even when he was a boy. She had imagined from his last photograph that he would be much stouter, much more bombastic. But then, in his sleep, perhaps those things fell from a man. She tried to turn away indifferently, but something in his face held her. She studied it. If he had been any other man, any stranger, she would have said from looking at him critically that kindness and generosity, self-respect and respect for women, were written all over the face before her. There was fine, firm modeling about the lips and the clean-shaven chin, and about the forehead the look almost of a scholar. Yet she thought she knew the man before her to be none of those things. How deceptive were looks! She would probably be envied rather than pitied by all who saw her. Well, perhaps that was better. She could the easier keep her trouble to herself. But stay, what was there about this man that seemed different? The smooth face? Yes. She had the dim impression that last night he wore a mustache. She must have been mistaken, of course. She had only looked at him when absolutely necessary, and her brain was in such a whirl. But still, there seemed to be something different about him. Her eyes wandered to the hand that lay across his breast. It was the fine, white hand of the professional man, the kind of hand that somehow attracts the eye with a sense of cleanness and strength. There was nothing flabby about it. George, as a boy, used to have big stumpy fingers and nails chewed down to the quick. She could remember how she used to hate to look at them when she was a little girl, and yet somehow could not keep her eyes away. She saw with relief that the nails on this hand were well shaped and well cared for. He looked very handsome and attractive as he lay there. The sun shot one of its early, daring bolts of light across his hair as the train turned in its course and lurched northward around a curve. It glinted there for a moment, like a miniature searchlight, traveling over the head, showing up every wave and curve. He had the kind of hair which makes a woman's hand instinctively long to touch it. Celia wondered at the curious